The silence of a Wyoming morning has a weight to it. It's not an absence of sound, but a presence of stillness, so profound you can feel it pressing on your skin. For 20 years, that stillness had been my sanctuary, a fortress I'd built out of timber and solitude, against the ghosts of a life I'd torched and left for dead. The frost on the cabin window pane was thick as cataract glass, turning the rising sun into a hazy pale watercolor. I was pulling on my worn boots, the leather groaning like an old man's bones, when I saw it. It wasn't the shape that first snagged my attention, but the wrongness of it. A dark, slumped form against the stark silver of my property-line fence out past the leafless cottonwoods. It looked like a sack of feed someone had discarded, except sacks of feed don't wear calico. My gut coiled into a knot of cold dread, a feeling I hadn't felt since the war, a sensation like swallowing ice. I grabbed my heavy sheepskin coat, my breath pluming in the frigid air as I stepped off the porch. The ground crunched under my boots, a sound like breaking bones. Each step an unwilling march toward a truth I already knew would scar the morning. As I drew closer, the details sharpened, resolving themselves from a vague anomaly into a vision straight from a fever dream. It was a girl. A child, really. Tied to the fence post with a length of rough hemp rope that looked thick enough to moor a ship. She was unconscious, her head lolled to one side, a curtain of dark hair matted with frost, and something darker I didn't want to name. Her dress, a simple thing of faded blue calico, was torn at the shoulder, exposing skin that was a mottled bruised purple against the inhuman white of the cold. Abandoned. Left like a broken piece of livestock whose worth had been calculated and found wanting. I knelt, the cold seeping through the denim of my trousers instantly. My weathered hands, usually steady from 2 decades of mending fences and breaking horses, trembled as I drew my knife. The rope burns on her wrists were a story in themselves, raw and red, and blistered angry wounds that spoke of a struggle against the inevitable. They were profane brands, testaments to a cruelty that turned my stomach. She'd been out here for hours, long enough for the unforgiving Wyoming night to work its way deep into her bones, long enough for a lesser soul to have already surrendered to it. The blade of my knife, usually reserved for cutting twine or skinning game, felt alien as I sawed through the thick fibers binding her. 20 years I'd lived out here, 20 years of deliberate isolation. My only conversations were with my horse and the wind. My only conflicts were with blizzards and drought. I had orchestrated a life of impenetrable peace, and in the space of a single sunup, it was being violated. As the last strand of the rope parted, the girl stirred. Not a gentle awakening, but a violent galvanic jolt. Her eyes snapped open, and they weren't the eyes of a child. They were the wild, terrified eyes of a cornered animal brimming with a horror that was ancient and absolute. She scrambled backward, crab-walking through the frosted dirt, her voice a raw, splintered thing that grated from a throat cracked by thirst. "Don't touch me." The words were a shield, a weapon, a plea. I froze, my hands held up in a gesture of peace I wasn't sure I felt. Inside, a cold rage was beginning to kindle. I'd already seen the dark thumb-shaped bruises modeling the pale skin of her arms, the unnatural way she favored her left side, as if her ribs were broken glass. Someone hadn't just abandoned this child. They had systematically broken her first. My jaw tightened until my teeth ached. A wave of vertigo washed over me as the image of the girl blurred, and for a gut-wrenching second I saw myself at that age, cowering in a barn, while the sound of heavy drunken footsteps approached. The signs were a language I knew by heart, a grammar of pain I'd spent my entire adult life trying to forget. "Easy now," I said, my voice lower and softer than I'd used in years. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." I stayed where I was kneeling in the dirt, giving her the space her terror demanded. She studied my face, her eyes darting over my features, searching for the telltale flicker of a lie. I'm a big man. 20 years of ranch work had layered muscle onto an already large frame, and my face was a roadmap of sun and hardship. I knew what she saw, a giant, a potential threat. But something in my own haunted gray eyes, some reflection of the ghosts we now shared, must have convinced her. She didn't run. "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my voice a low rumble. "Emma," she whispered. The word didn't sound like a name. It sounded like a confession, like a sin she was admitting to. My gaze fell to the severed rope still clutched in my fist, then to the deep parallel tracks gouged into the frosted earth, leading away from my fence and disappearing toward the main road. Someone had driven her out here in the dead of night, dragged her from a vehicle, and left her to die. Here in the Wyoming territory, a death sentence could come in many forms. The cold, the wolves, or worse, the two-legged predators who roamed these empty spaces. "Who did this to you, Emma?" Her face went blank. It wasn't the vacant look of someone who couldn't remember. It was the careful, deliberate emptiness of someone who remembered far, far too much. A steel door slammed shut on a room full of monsters. Her whisper, when it came, was so quiet it was nearly stolen by the wind. But it hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. "My father." The world tilted. My own father's face, bloated and cruel, swam before my eyes. His whiskey-sour breath, his heavy hands. I had spent 2 decades and 1,200 miles running from that memory. And now, here it was, staring back at me through the shattered innocence of this child's eyes. The fortress I'd built was crumbling. I stood slowly, my mind a maelstrom. The logical part of me, the part that had survived the war and built this ranch from nothing, screamed at me to be smart. "Take her to town. Hand her over to Sheriff Morrison. Let the law handle it." That was the safe thing, the clean thing. It would put this nightmare back in a box and let me return to my silence. But I knew Morrison. He was a company man, a creature of convenience, who smoothed over rough edges to keep the peace. When it came to family matters, especially in a territory where powerful men wrote their own laws, Morrison's questions became soft and his vision blurry. Emma would end up in a church orphanage, at best or worse, returned to the very monster who had left her here. Her fate would be a piece of paper in a file another tragedy whispered about and then forgotten. I looked at her, struggling to her feet, wincing with every movement, holding herself with the rigid posture of someone perpetually expecting another blow. My decision wasn't a decision at all. It was an inevitability. "Can you walk?" I asked. She gave a small, jerky nod. "Come on then, let's get you inside." We had taken no more than 5 steps toward the distant silhouette of my cabin when I saw them. Faint at first, just a smudge of brown against the vast pale blue of the horizon. Dust clouds. But they weren't the lazy plumes of a passing carriage. These were moving with purpose, with speed. I've learned to read the prairie the way other men read books. The wind, the sky, the dust, they all tell a story. This story was one of violence. 3 riders moving with the hungry urgency of wolves closing in. I had maybe 20 minutes before they breached my property line. And some deep, cold instinct in my gut told me they weren't bringing good news. They were coming to finish the job. Inside the cabin, the illusion of safety was thin as smoke. Emma sat at my rough-hewn kitchen table, a statue carved from fear, her eyes darting toward the door with every creak of the floorboards. I poured water from the clay pitcher into a tin cup and set it before her. My hand was steady, a deliberate counterpoint to the shaking I saw in hers. "Drink slowly," I said. She obeyed, but her hands trembled so badly the cup rattled a frantic rhythm against her teeth. It was a sound I knew. I had heard it every morning for the first 10 years after I'd finally broken free of my own father. A sound that came from a fear so deep it lived in your marrow. I moved to the window, my eyes fixed on the approaching dust cloud. The smudges had resolved into distinct figures, now dark omens on the plains. "Those riders coming?" I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the tension. "They have anything to do with you?" The cup froze halfway to her lips. She didn't have to speak. The look that washed over her face was a full confession. Her eyes widened, the wild terror from the fence line returning tenfold. "He's coming back for me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's coming to make sure." "Your father?" I stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, the story spilling out of her in ragged, broken pieces. "I was payment for his debts." The words were so small, so clinical, they were obscene. "A poker game. He lost everything. But then the man he owed said I wasn't worth enough. That I was damaged." She flinched as she said the word, as if it were a fresh brand. "That I'd bring shame to whoever took me." He was angry. He said my father tried to cheat him. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such grotesque depravity that it made my blood run cold. I remembered my own father's voice, slurred with whiskey, explaining how children were burdens that smart men learned to shed. "So he brought you out here." I finished for her, the rage in my chest, a physical weight. "Tied you to my fence to die." Emma nodded, a single tear finally tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "He said the wolves would clean up his mistake. No body, no questions." Something settled in my chest then. It wasn't fear. It was the familiar, heavy certainty of a decision that would change everything. The kind of decision I hadn't had to make since I wore a uniform blue. I had spent 20 years meticulously avoiding this exact kind of trouble, keeping my head down, my business to myself, building a wall of solitude around my fractured soul. But looking at Emma, seeing my own childhood of terror written in her eyes, I knew I was done running. The fortress hadn't been a sanctuary. It had been a cage. And the door had just been kicked open. I turned from the window and let my gaze fall on the Winchester rifle hanging in its rack above the cold fireplace. "Well," I said, my voice low and hard as granite, "looks like your father miscalculated." Emma shot to her feet so fast her chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor. "You don't understand. He's not alone. The men he owes money to, they're dangerous men. They're coming with him." I turned fully to face her. "How dangerous?" "The kind that burn farms to the ground for a missing calf. The kind that don't ask questions before they start shooting." The dust cloud was closer now, much closer. I could make out the individual riders, 3 men riding hard. My blood went cold when I saw what one of them was leading. A rope taut and stained dark dragged something heavy behind his horse. It bounced and skidded across the hard-packed earth, a mangled, bloody shape. My best heifer. It wasn't just a dead animal. It was a message. A declaration. They hadn't just come to finish a job. They had come for war. They want you to know what happens to people who interfere. Emma whispered, her voice devoid of hope. She had read my expression perfectly. I didn't answer. I walked to the gun cabinet against the far wall and unlocked it. 20 years of peace on this ranch. 20 years of watching the sun rise and set over an empty horizon. And now it was ending, because I couldn't walk away from a child who was wearing my own ghosts. I pulled out my old Colt pistol and a box of cartridges. As I began to load the Winchester, feeling the familiar cold weight of the brass rounds in my hand, I realized something that surprised me. The tremor in my hands was gone. The cold dread had burned away, replaced by a clear, hot certainty. For the first time in 2 decades, I felt like myself again. Not the man who ran, but the man who survived. "Emma," I said, my voice steady now, cutting through her fear. "You know how to shoot?" She shook her head, her eyes wide. "Then, you're about to learn." The 3 riders pulled up just outside rifle range, a smart, calculated move that spoke of experience. They were close enough for me to see the malice on their faces, but far enough to make a shot from the cabin a difficult gamble. The man in the center, the one I took for Emma's father, was thick-set and slovenly, with graying hair and a face that looked permanently flushed from cheap whiskey. He sat his horse uncomfortably, a coward, trying to project authority. The other 2 were different. They were younger, harder, whittled down to bone and sinew by a life of casual violence. They had the cold, dead eyes of men who killed for pay and enjoyed their work. "Hayes!" the older man, Thomas Garrett, bellowed. His voice was a weak imitation of a powerful man's roar. "I know you got my daughter in there. Send her out." I stepped out onto the porch, the Winchester held loosely in my hands, but ready. I could feel Emma's presence behind me, positioned at the back window as I'd instructed, the old Colt clutched in her small hands. Her hands, I noted, were steadier now that she had a task, a purpose beyond simply being afraid. "She's not your daughter anymore, Garrett," I called back, my voice carrying easily across the still air. "You forfeited that right when you left her for the wolves." Garrett's laugh was a wet, ugly sound. "That little whore belongs to me until I say different. Hand her over and we'll call it even for the trespassing." My finger tightened on the trigger, the impulse to wipe that sneer off his face so strong it was a physical force. But I held back. These weren't just random drifters. Their confidence was too solid. They were backed by something bigger. "Who are you working for?" I yelled. It was a shot in the dark, but I needed to know the shape of the beast I was facing. It wasn't Garrett who answered. It was one of the younger, colder ones. He nudged his horse forward a few paces, a lazy grin on his face that didn't touch his eyes. "Marcus Devlin sends his regards." The name hit me like a physical blow. My blood, which had been running hot with rage, turned to ice. Every rancher, every farmer, every shopkeep within 100 miles knew that name. Marcus Devlin. A man who had bled this territory dry, who owned half of it through fear and the other half through bullets. He was more than a man. He was a legend, a boogeyman parents used to scare their children, except he was terrifyingly real. If Garrett owed Devlin money, this wasn't about a runaway girl anymore. This was about trespassing on the property of a king. "Devlin wants his property back." The gunman continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "The girl was collateral on a significant debt. Her daddy here decided to try and dispose of the merchandise instead of paying up. A foolish, sentimental move." Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his bluster evaporating under the cold gaze of his supposed ally. "She ain't worth what he was asking. Damaged goods." "That's for Mr. Devlin to decide," the gunman snapped, his voice turning sharp as a razor. "But he's willing to be reasonable. Hand over the girl, and you, Hayes, can keep your ranch. Hell, we'll even let you keep breathing." The words hung in the air, brutal and transactional. Collateral, property, damaged goods. I glanced back toward the cabin window where I knew Emma was listening. They were talking about a 16-year-old girl like she was a sack of grain. It was the same language my own father had used, the same cold, dehumanizing arithmetic of men who saw people as assets to be liquidated. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The lead gunman's smile widened, a predatory baring of teeth. "Well, then we take the girl anyway. We burn this pathetic excuse for a ranch to the ground. And you become another tragic story they tell around the campfire about what happens to stubborn old fools who interfere with Mr. Devlin's business." He gestured with his chin toward the mangled carcass of my heifer. The message couldn't have been clearer. Devlin had the resources. He had the men. He had a reputation built on the bones of men far tougher than me. But as I stood there staring down the barrels of their guns, I realized something critical. They were here talking. They hadn't just ridden in with guns blazing. That meant they wanted to avoid a prolonged fight, at least for now. Devlin wanted this quiet. "I need time to think," I called out, playing for a resource more valuable than ammunition. The gunman laughed. "You got 1 hour, old man. Then we come calling and we won't be asking politely." As they pulled their horses back to their waiting position, I felt a small hand on my arm. I turned. Emma had come to the doorway behind me. She was trembling again, but her eyes held a new, more profound kind of terror. "There's something else," she whispered, her voice so faint I had to lean in to hear. "Something I didn't tell you. About Devlin." I ushered her back inside, closing the heavy cabin door and sliding the bolt home. Whatever she was about to say, it wasn't for them to hear. My mind raced. How could this possibly get worse? Emma stood in the center of the room, wringing her hands, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Devlin, he isn't just collecting a debt," she said, her voice a fragile whisper that seemed to crack the very air in the cabin. She looked up at me, and her eyes were two black pools of despair. "He's my real father." The words didn't register at first. They were a jumble of sounds that my brain refused to assemble into a coherent thought. Then they landed a physical blow that staggered me. I sank into my chair, the world spinning. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the image of the swaggering gunman on the porch with this broken child. "The man out there, Thomas Garrett," she continued, her voice gaining a frantic edge. "He's my stepfather. He married my mother when I was small after Devlin threw us out." The twisted pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a picture of such profound and calculated cruelty that it took my breath away. Devlin hadn't just been some anonymous moneylender. "He abandoned you," I said, my voice flat. "Worse?" Emma choked out the story now, a torrent she couldn't contain. "When I turned 16 last month, he decided he wanted me back. He sent word. He didn't want me back as a daughter. He just wanted me." The implication was a sickness that filled the room. Thomas owed him a fortune from a poker game. Devlin offered to forgive the entire debt in exchange for me. I'd known men like Devlin during the war. Officers who traded lives for strategic advantage, who saw soldiers not as men, but as pieces on a map. Men who took whatever they wanted and called it victory. But Thomas panicked. Emma said, her hands clenching into white-knuckled fists at her sides. He knew. He was afraid of what Devlin would do if he found out what kind of man he really was, what he'd been doing to me all these years. The unspoken word hung in the dead quiet of the room, a ghost of unspeakable trauma. He knew Devlin would kill him not for hurting me, but for damaging his property. I understood. I finally completely understood. The fear in her eyes wasn't just of a beating. It was the soul-deep terror of a life lived as an object. Thomas Garrett wasn't just a coward who'd tried to discard a child. He was a monster who had been preying on her for years, and his final act of cowardice was an attempt to cover his own vile tracks. So instead of facing Devlin's anger, I said, piecing it together, he decided to let you die out here. Make it look like you ran away and were taken by the wild. Then he could tell Devlin you were already gone when the debt came due. Emma nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her fractured pieces together. The situation had morphed from a simple matter of right and wrong into a multi-headed hydra of evil. Protecting her from Garrett was one thing, but this keeping her away from a biological father who had discarded her once, only to now view her as a commodity to be repossessed for his own twisted purposes. That was another war entirely. "There's more," Emma said, her voice dropping even lower. "Devlin doesn't know. He doesn't know what Thomas has been doing. If he finds out, he'll kill Thomas. But then he'll still take me." "And you'd rather die than go with either of them," I stated. It wasn't a question. The desperate defiance in her posture was the answer. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken histories. I thought of my own father, of the beatings, the gnawing hunger, the suffocating fear. That was the only air I breathed. I ran away at 17 with nothing but the clothes on my back and a fire of hatred in my belly. It had taken me 20 years to build this life, this shell of safety where no one could ever hold power over me again. Now this girl was asking me to tear it all down. "Emma," I said slowly, the words feeling rusty from disuse. "There's something you should know about me. About why I understand." She looked up, her gaze searching, desperate for an anchor in this storm. "My father sold me," I said the confession, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth, "to a man named Crawford. Payment for a gambling debt, just like you. I was 15. I spent 2 years as that man's property, his slave, before I found the courage to run." Her eyes widened, a flicker of stunned recognition in their depths. The chasm between us, the one of age and experience, had just vanished. She wasn't looking at a stranger anymore. She was looking at a mirror. "The scars on my back," I continued, my voice thick, "they're not from the war. They're from Crawford's whip. The reason I've lived alone for 20 years is because I swore on my life that no one would ever have that kind of power over me again." Outside, a sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by a shout. "Time's almost up, Hayes." I looked at Emma, and I didn't just see a terrified girl. I saw the 15-year-old boy I used to be, trapped and hopeless. But I had been able to run. She couldn't. She was 16, alone, with nowhere left on this earth to go. The choice was never a choice at all. It was a debt I owed to that boy I left behind. "What are you thinking?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I walked back to the fireplace and picked up the Winchester. I checked the ammunition again, the rhythmic click-clack of the lever action, a final steadying beat. "I'm thinking," I said, my gaze fixed on the door, "it's time I stopped running." I stepped back out onto the porch just as the hour expired. The sun was higher now, harsh and unforgiving, bleaching the color from the landscape. The 3 riders were already moving, urging their horses from a walk into a slow, menacing trot, closing the distance. "Time's up, Hayes," Garrett yelled, trying to reclaim his authority. "Hand over the girl, and we ride out peaceful." "Can't do that, Thomas," I called back, my voice calm and carrying a flat stone skipping over a pond of violence. The lead gunman, the one with eyes like chips of flint, urged his horse ahead. "Then you've chosen poorly, old man." His hand started to move toward the colt at his hip. But before anyone could draw iron, a new sound intruded, rolling over the prairie like distant thunder. It was the drumming of more hooves, many more coming from the ridge behind my cabin. At least 6 riders moving fast, an organized column of death. Thomas Garrett's face went white as a sheet. His jaw fell slack. He wasn't supposed to come himself. My blood chilled. I didn't need to ask who he was. Leading the new group was a man who rode not like a cowboy, but like a king surveying his domain. Marcus Devlin. He was older than I'd expected, maybe 50, with a mane of silver hair and a tailored black coat that looked absurdly out of place in the Wyoming dust. He was flanked by men who were carbon copies of the first two hard, remorseless killers who had earned their reputation with blood and loyalty. My odds had just gone from impossible to suicidal. 9 against 1. Devlin brought his magnificent black horse to a halt, letting it step delicately around the festering carcass of my heifer. He surveyed the scene with an air of mild annoyance, as if he'd stumbled upon a squabble among children. "Well, well," Devlin said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was more unsettling than any shout. "What do we have here?" Thomas Garrett's voice cracked. "Mr. Devlin, I can explain." "I'm sure you can, Thomas," Devlin interrupted, not even gracing him with a glance, his pale, calculating eyes fixed on me. "But first, I'd like to hear from Mr. Hayes. I understand you have something that belongs to me." I kept my rifle trained on the original 3, but I was acutely aware of Devlin's men spreading out, fanning into a half circle that would catch me in an inescapable crossfire. "Nothing here belongs to you," I said, my own voice sounding thin against the weight of his presence. Devlin smiled, a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. You see Thomas here," he said, finally gesturing dismissively at the pathetic man, "owes me a considerable sum. The collateral for that debt is currently hiding in your cabin." He paused, his eyes narrowing. Emma's not collateral," I shot back. "She's a human being." "Emma?" Devlin's voice sharpened, and a strange possessive light entered his eyes. "Is that what she's calling herself these days?" The way he said it made my skin crawl. This wasn't just about money. This was personal. This was about ownership of the deepest, most twisted kind. "I think," he continued, "it's time we sorted this out properly." He finally turned his cold gaze on his terrified subordinate. "Thomas, you lying, sniveling snake. Did you really think you could let my daughter die in the wilderness and I wouldn't find out?" The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Daughter. He knew. He had always known. It wasn't a secret he had just discovered. It was a fact he had wielded as part of the transaction. Garrett's horse danced nervously as he stammered, "She ain't worth the trouble, Mr. Devlin. I was doing you a favor." Devlin's hand was a blur. It moved with an unnatural speed that defied his age and expensive clothes. The report of his pistol cracked across the prairie, a single decisive punctuation mark. Thomas Garrett crumpled in his saddle, clutching a blossoming red flower on his shoulder as he toppled to the ground. "Nobody asked you to think, Thomas," Devlin said coolly, holstering his weapon as if he'd just swatted a fly. He hadn't killed him, I realized. He had just disabled him. It was a demonstration of control, cold and absolute. "Now then," Devlin said, turning his attention back to me as if nothing had happened. "Let's discuss this like civilized men. I want my daughter back, Mr. Hayes. And for your trouble, I am prepared to be generous." Before I could answer, a new sound ripped through the tense standoff. The sharp, violent crash of breaking glass from the rear of the cabin. Emma. She was running. The sound sent every man reaching for their guns. "Find her!" Devlin roared, his civilized veneer vanishing in an instant, replaced by the raw fury of a thwarted predator. 3 of his men spurred their horses, rounding the cabin in a storm of dust and hooves. My mind splintered. Protect her escape or face down the remaining 6 armed men. I made my choice in a heartbeat. I dove off the porch as a volley of bullets splintered the wood where I'd been standing, rolling behind the heavy horse trough as lead whistled past my ears. My Winchester bucked against my shoulder twice. One of Devlin's men was thrown from his horse like a rag doll. A second cried out and tumbled from his saddle, clutching his leg. Still impossible odds. "Enough!" Devlin's voice boomed over the gunfire. I want her alive, you idiots, alive! The shooting sputtered and died, leaving a silence punctuated by the groans of the wounded man and the nervous stamping of horses. I was pinned down. 7 men left, including Devlin. 3 rounds left in my rifle. 2 of his men had dismounted and were flanking me, moving with predatory grace from cover to cover. In minutes, they'd have me in a clean crossfire. "This is pointless, Hayes," Devlin called out. "She can't outrun horses on this prairie. There's nowhere to hide. Surrender now, and I will be merciful." I risked a glance. The flanking men were closing in. I heard the thunder of hooves returning. The riders he'd sent after Emma. Had they caught her? "Boss!" one of them yelled, pulling his horse to a skidding halt. "She's holed up in the rocks behind the ridge. She's got a gun, and she knows how to use it." A wave of fierce, desperate relief washed over me. The rocky outcropping. The place I'd taught myself to shoot 20 years ago, when I first came here. It was a natural fortress full of shadows and angles with clear sight lines. She could hold out there for hours. She had listened. She had learned. Stubborn girl. Devlin muttered a strange mix of frustration and... was it pride? Just like her mother. Seeing his attention momentarily diverted, I saw my one desperate chance. I exploded from behind the trough, sprinting for the corner of the cabin, bullets churning up the dirt at my heels. I slammed against the log wall, my lungs burning, heart hammering against my ribs. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Hayes." Devlin's voice was closer now. "I have 20 more men an hour's ride from here. When they arrive, this ranch will cease to exist. But it doesn't have to be this way." There was a new note in his voice, a plea buried deep beneath the command. He didn't want to wait. "Why not just let her go?" I yelled back, panting for breath. "You threw her away once. Why is she so damned important now?" The silence stretched long and heavy. For a moment I thought I had pushed too far. When Devlin finally answered, his voice had lost its bluster. It was quieter, heavier, laced with a poison that sounded like regret. "Because she's the only family I have left." He said the words stark and bare. "And because 16 years ago, I let my damned pride keep me from claiming what was mine." His voice turned darker, hardening again. "I will not make that mistake twice." This wasn't about a debt. It was about obsession. A twisted, possessive atonement. From the rocks behind the ridge, Emma's Colt cracked once. A man near Devlin cursed and clapped a hand to his arm, a pinprick of defiance. 8 men left, including the wounded. I peered around the corner of the cabin and my blood ran cold. Devlin was pulling something from his saddlebags. Not another gun. Something wrapped in oilcloth. Dynamite. "Last chance, Hayes." Devlin roared, his voice echoing across the prairie, now the howl of a madman. He held up a stick of dynamite, a lit fuse sputtering in his hand. "Convince her to come down, or I will blast those rocks to dust with her inside them." He was preparing the charge with steady, practiced hands. This wasn't a bluff. He would literally tear the earth apart, destroy the very thing he'd come for, rather than be denied again. "You have 1 minute to talk sense into her," he yelled, the fuse burning shorter, an angry spitting snake. "Then I solve this problem, permanently." The world narrowed to that burning fuse. My mind raced through 1,000 desperate scenarios, all ending in fire and blood. There was no way out. Not with guns. And then in the stark terror of that final minute, I saw it. The one weapon he hadn't considered. The only weapon I had left. The truth. I made the hardest decision of my life. I dropped my rifle in the dust and stepped out from behind the cabin, my hands raised. "Emma!" I shouted, my voice raw, projecting toward the rocks. "Come down, it's over." Her voice, clear and defiant, rang back instantly. I'd rather die up here. No. My own voice cracked with a desperation that was utterly real. The fuse was a sizzling stump seconds from its end. Listen to me, there's another way. I turned my full attention to the silver-haired demon preparing to murder his own child. Devlin, I roared, pouring every ounce of will I had into the words. You throw that dynamite, and you'll never know the truth. The real reason Thomas tried to get rid of her, the burning fuse spat, but Devlin's arm froze. His eyes, chips of pale ice, sharpened on me. What truth? Time seemed to slow each heartbeat a lifetime. Why do you think he was so afraid of you finding her? Why do you think he called her damaged goods? What do you think that monster has been doing to your daughter for the past 6 years? I saw it then. I saw the dawning of a new kind of horror on Marcus Devlin's face. Not the anger of being cheated, but the soul-sick revulsion of a man staring into an abyss he helped create. The civilized mask shattered, and for the first time I saw the man beneath. And he was horrified. His hand moved a fraction of a second too late, trying to snuff out the fuse or hurl the stick away. I was already moving. I launched myself off my feet, a desperate full-body dive, not at the dynamite, but at him. We collided in a brutal tangle of limbs. The lit stick flew from his grasp, tumbling end over end through the air. The explosion was cataclysmic. It didn't hit the rocks. It detonated in the open prairie 20 yards away. A deafening concussion that shook the earth itself, sending a plume of dirt and rock and scorched air raining down on us all. The world was ringing silence and settling dust. When my vision cleared, I was on the ground staring up the barrel of Devlin's Colt. But the man's eyes weren't on me. They were fixed on the groaning, crawling form of Thomas Garrett trying to drag his wounded body away through the dirt. Thomas, Devlin said. His voice was dead quiet, devoid of all emotion, and it was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. Come here. What followed was not a fight. It was an execution. It was swift and brutal and absolute. Thomas Garrett died knowing exactly why his terrified gurgles silenced by a single final shot. Devlin's remaining men watched their faces grim stone as their boss dispensed a justice colder than any judge's sentence. But when it was over, the rage seemed to drain from him, leaving behind something hollow and broken. He stood over the body for a long moment, then holstered his pistol and looked up toward the rocks where Emma waited, a silent sentinel. He looked old suddenly, decades older than he had an hour ago. Emma, he called out, and his voice was a ghost of its former self filled with a ragged sorrow. I'm sorry. The words drifted across the prairie, not a command, but something that sounded almost like a prayer. I'm not coming down, she shouted back, her voice still defiant, but with a new tremor in it. I know, Devlin replied softly, and I'm not asking you to. He walked stiffly to his horse and mounted, gathering the reins in his hand. He looked at me, and his eyes were no longer those of a king or a killer, but of a man who had just seen the final ugly truth of his own life. Hayes, he said quietly, she's not safe. Not as long as I'm alive. Men like me, we don't change. He paused, his gaze drifting back toward the rocks one last time. But men like you do. He reached into the inner pocket of his fine coat and pulled out a thick, leather-bound envelope. He tossed it into the dust at my feet. There's enough money in there to take her far away from here. Colorado, Oregon, I don't care. Go start over. Somewhere I'll never find you. Why? I asked, the single word all I could manage. He looked toward the ridge at the daughter he would never claim, the ghost he could never appease. Because 16 years ago, I failed to be her father. He said, his voice heavy with the weight of that failure. Today, you succeeded. He wheeled his horse around without another word. His men, a silent, grim procession, followed him. They rode away, leaving me alone in the sudden, profound silence surrounded by the carnage of the day and the weight of an impossible gift. An hour later, as the sun began to bleed orange and purple across the western sky, Emma came down from the rocks. We didn't speak. There were no words for what had happened. Without ceremony, we buried Thomas Garrett in a shallow grave behind the barn. Then we packed what little we owned, a spare change of clothes, the remaining ammunition, and Devlin's thick envelope of money. By sunset, we were riding south, towards Colorado, towards a future neither of us could have possibly imagined when the sun had risen that morning. Behind us, the Wyoming prairie stretched out empty and vast, holding the secrets of the day in the gathering darkness, finally at peace. And for the first time in 20 years, so was I.